Hi everyone, it's Miss Croy, your librarian, and I have my kitty cat Sammy who is joining me today, so you may see her pop in and out. Just ignore her the best you can. I know she likes to be center of attention. But anyway, we're going to be reading the book Frindle, and I know that I kind of talked to you all about context clues, and I know you're kind of going over it in class, so just keep that in mind. And I want you to take notes. If there's a word that you do not know, write the word down and see if you can figure out through context clues what it could be. Or even if you don't write it down, just think about what that word might be, okay? So, our book Frindle, some of you all probably have read it. I know it's a popular book, but pretend like you never have and enjoy it, okay? So, Frindle. And this is by Andrew Clements. Pictures by Brian Selznick. I think I said that right. Okay, chapter 1 is titled Nick. If you ask the kids and the teachers at Lincoln Elementary School to make 3 lists, all the really bad kids, all the really smart kids, and all the really good kids, Nick Allen would not be on any of them. Nick deserved a list all by himself, and everyone knew it. Was Nick a troublemaker? Hard to say. One thing's for sure, Nick Allen had plenty of ideas, and he knew what to do with them. One time in 3rd grade, Nick decided to turn Mrs. Deaver's room into a tropical island. What kid in New Hampshire isn't ready for a little summer in February? So first he got everyone to make small palm trees out of green and brown construction paper and tape them onto the corners of each desk. Miss Deaver had only been a teacher for about 6 months, and she was delighted. That's so cute! The next day, all the girls wore paper flowers in their hair, and all the boys wore sunglasses and beach hats. Miss Deaver clapped her hands and said, "It's so colorful." The day after that, Nick turned the classroom thermostat up to about 90 degrees with a little screwdriver he had brought from home. All the kids changed into shorts and t-shirts with no shoes, and when Miss Deaver left the room for a minute, Nick spread about 10 cups of fine white sand all over the classroom floor. Miss Deaver was surprised again at just how creative her students could be. But the sand got tracked out into the hallway where Manny, the custodian, did not think it was creative at all, and he stomped right down to the office. The principal followed the trail of sand, and when she arrived, Miss Deaver was teaching the hula to some kids near the front of the room, and a tall, thin, shirtless boy with chestnut hair was just skipping a Nerf volleyball over a net made from 6 t-shirts tied together. The 3rd grade trip to the South Seas ended suddenly. Okay, so I have to say, I'm not even 6 months into being the librarian, and I would be furious if you all put sand all through the library. I don't know how Miss Deaver was so patient, but kudos to Miss Deaver for being patient. And I'm sure all the other teachers would be furious if you did that too. But that didn't stop Nick from trying to liven up things. Lincoln Elementary needed a good jolt once in a while, and Nick was just the guy to deliver it. About a year later, Nick made the great blackbird discovery. One night, he learned on a TV show that red-winged blackbirds give this high-pitched chirp when a hawk or some other danger comes near. Because of the way sound travels, the hunter birds can't tell where the high-pitched chirp is coming from. The next day, during silent reading, Nick glanced at his teacher and he noticed that Mrs. Avery's nose was curved, kind of like the beak of a hawk. So Nick let out a high, squeaky blackbird peep. Mrs. Avery jerked her head up from her book and looked around. She couldn't tell who did it, so she just said, "Shh," to the whole class. A minute later, Nick did it again, louder. Beep! This time, there was a little giggling from the class, but Miss Avery pretended not to hear that sound, and about 15 seconds later, she slowly stood up and walked to the back of the classroom. Without taking his eyes off his book and without moving at all, Nick put his heart and soul into the highest and most annoying chirp of all. Beep! Miss Avery pounced. "Janet Fisk, you stop that this instant!" Janet, who was sitting 4 rows away from Nick, promptly turned white, then bright crimson. But it wasn't me. Honest. There was a catch in Janet's voice, as if she might cry. Mrs. Avery knew she had made a mistake, and she apologized to Janet. "But someone is asking for big trouble," said Mrs. Avery, looking more like a hawk every second. Nick kept reading, and he didn't make a peep. At lunchtime, Nick talked to Janet. He felt bad that Miss Avery had pounced on her. Janet lived in Nick's neighborhood, and sometimes they played together. She was good at baseball, and she was better at soccer than most of the kids in the whole school, boys or girls. Nick said, "Hey Janet, I'm sorry you got yelled at during greeting. It was my fault. I was the one who made that sound." "You did?" said Janet. "But how come Miss Avery thought it was me?" So Nick told her about the blackbirds, and Janet thought it was pretty interesting. Then she tried making a peep or two, and Janet's chirps were even higher and squeakier than Nick's. She promised to keep everything a secret. For the rest of Nick's 4th grade year, at least once a week, Miss Avery heard a loud beep from somewhere in her classroom. Sometimes it was a high-pitched chirp, and sometimes it was a very high-pitched chirp. Mrs. Avery never figured out who was making that sound, and gradually she trained herself to ignore it. But she still looked like a hawk. To Nick, the whole thing was just one long and successful science experiment, and Janet Fisk enjoyed it too. Chapter 2, Mrs. Granger. 5th grade was different. That was the year to get ready for middle school. 5th grade meant passing classes. It meant no morning recess. It meant real letter grades on your report cards. But most of all, it meant Mrs. Granger. There were about 150 kids in 5th grade, and there were 7 5th grade teachers, 2 math, 2 science, 2 social studies, but only 1 language arts teacher. In language arts, Miss Granger had a monopoly and a reputation. Mrs. Granger lived alone in a tidy little house in an older part of town. She drove an old pale blue car to school every morning, rain or shine, snow or sleet, hail or wind. She had a perfect attendance record that stretched back further than anyone could remember. Her hair was almost white, swept away from her face and up into something like a nest on the back of her head. Unlike some of the younger women teachers, she never wore pants to school. She had 2 skirt and jacket outfits, her gray uniform and her blue uniform, which she always wore over a white shirt with a little cameo pin at the neck. And Mrs. Granger was one of those people who never wore sweats. It had to be over 90 degrees before she even took off her jacket. She was small as teachers goes. There were even some 5th graders who were taller. But Mrs. Granger seemed like a giant. It was her eyes that did it. They were dark gray, and if she turned them on full power, they could make you feel like a speck of dust. Her eyes could twinkle and laugh too, and kids said she could crack really funny jokes, but it wasn't the jokes that made her famous. Everyone was sure that Mrs. Granger had X-ray vision. Don't even think about chewing a piece of gum within 50 feet of her. If you did, Mrs. Granger would see you and catch you and make you stick the gum onto a bright yellow index card. Then she would safety pin the card to the front of your shirt, and you'd have to wear it for the rest of the school day. After that, you had to take it home and have your mom or dad sign the card and bring it back to Mrs. Granger the next day. And it didn't matter to Miss Granger if you weren't in 5th grade, because the way she saw it, sooner or later, you would be. All the kids at Lincoln Elementary knew that at the end of the line, 5th grade, Mrs. Granger would be the one grading their spelling test and their reading test, and worst of all, their vocabulary test, week after week, month after month. Every language arts teacher in the world enjoys making kids use the dictionary. Check your spelling, check that definition, check those syllabus. But Mrs. Granger didn't just enjoy the dictionary, she loved the dictionary, almost worshipped it. Her weekly vocabulary list was 35 words long, sometimes longer. As if that wasn't bad enough, there was a word for the day on the blackboard every morning. If you gave yourself a day off and didn't write one down and look it up and learn the definition, sooner or later Mrs. Granger would find out. And then, just for you, there would be 2 words for the day for the whole week. Here's the picture of Mrs. Granger. So now you can kind of see why maybe they're a little bit intimidated by her. And I know some of you all think your teacher's just awful and so mean, and maybe you should be a little bit thankful because at least they're not Miss Granger. Mrs. Granger kept a full set of 30 dictionaries on a shelf at the back of the room, but her pride and joy was one of those huge dictionaries with every word in the universe in it, the kind of book it takes 2 kids to carry. It sat on its own little table at the front of her classroom, sort of like the altar at the front of a church. Every graduate of Lincoln Elementary School for the past 35 years could remember standing at that table listening to Mrs. Granger's battle cry, "Look it up! That's why we have the dictionary!" Even before the school year started, when it was still the summer before 5th grade, for Nick and his friends, Mrs. Granger was already busy. Every parent of every new 5th grader got a letter from her. Nick's mom read part of it out loud during dinner one night in August. Every home is expected to have a good dictionary in it so that each student can do his or her homework properly. Good spelling and good grammar and good word skills are essential for every student. Clear thinking requires a command of the English language, and 5th grade is the ideal time for every girl and boy to acquire an expanded vocabulary. And then there was a list of the dictionaries that Mrs. Granger thought would be acceptable for home study. Mrs. Allen said, "It's so nice to have a teacher who takes her work this seriously." Nick groaned and tried to enjoy the rest of his hamburger, but even watermelon for dessert didn't cheer him up. Nick had no particular use for the dictionary. He liked words a lot, and he was good at using them, but he figured that he got all the words he needed just by reading, and he read all the time. When Nick ran into a word he didn't know, he asked his brother or his dad or whoever was handy what it meant, and if they knew, they'd tell him. But not Mrs. Granger. He had heard all about her, and he had seen 5th graders in the library last year, noses stuck in their dictionaries, frantically trying to finish their vocabulary sheets before English class. It was still a week before school, and Nick already felt like 5th grade was going to be a very long year. Chapter 3, The Question. The first day of school was always a get acquainted day. Books were passed out and there was a lot of chatter. Everyone asked, "What did you do over the summer?" Periods 1 through 6 went by very smoothly for Nick. But then came period 7. Mrs. Granger's class was all business. The first thing they did was take a vocabulary pretest to see how many of the 35 words for the week the kids already knew. Tremble, circular, orchestra, the list went on and on. Nick knew most of them. Then there was a handout about class procedures. After that, there was a review paper about cursive writing, and then there was a sample sheet showing how the headings should look on every assignment. No let-up for 37 minutes straight. Nick was an expert at asking the delaying question, also known as teacher stopper or the guaranteed time waster. At 3 minutes before the bell, in that split second between the end of the day's classwork and the announcement of tomorrow's homework, Nick could launch a question guaranteed to sidetrack the teacher long enough to delay or even wipe out the homework assignment. Timing was important, but asking the right question, that was the hard part. Questions about stuff in the news, questions about the college the teacher went to, questions about the teacher's favorite book or sport or hobby. Nick knew all the tricks, and he had been very successful in the past. Here he was in 5th grade, near the end of his very first language arts class with Mrs. Granger, and Nick could feel a homework assignment coming the way a farmer can feel a rainstorm. Mrs. Granger paused to catch her breath, and Nick's hand shot up. She glanced down at her seating chart, and then up at him. Her sharp gray eyes were not even turned to half power. "Yes, Nicholas, Mrs. Granger, you have so many dictionaries in this room, and that huge one especially. Where did all those come from?" "Did they just get copied from other dictionaries? It sure is a big book." It was a perfect thought grenade. Kapow! Several kids smiled and a few peeked at the clock. Nick was famous for this, and the whole class knew what he was doing. Unfortunately, so did Mrs. Granger. She hesitated a moment and gave Nick a smile that was just a little too sweet to be real. Her eyes were the color of a thundercloud. "Why, what an interesting question, Nicholas. I could talk about that for hours, I bet." She glanced around the classroom. "Do the rest of you want to know too?" Everyone nodded yes. "Very well then, Nicholas. Will you do some research on that subject and give a little oral report to the class? If you find out the answer yourself, it will mean so much more than if I just told you. Please have your report ready for our next class." Mrs. Granger smiled at him again, very sweetly. Then it was back to business. "Now the homework for tomorrow can be found on page 12 of your Words Alive book." Nick barely heard the assignment. His heart was pounding and he felt small, very small. He could feel the tops of his ears glowing red, a complete shutdown, an extra assignment, and probably a little black mark next to his name on the seating chart. Everything he had heard about this teacher was true. Don't mess around with the Lone Granger. Chapter 4, Word Detective. And this will probably, we'll get to chapter 5 and then we'll stop, okay? But anyway, Word Detective. It was a beautiful September afternoon, just like today. Bright sun, cool breeze, and a blue sky. But not for Nick. Nick had to do a little report for the next day, plus copy out all the definitions for 35 words for Mrs. Granger. This was not the way school was supposed to work, not for Nick. There was a rule at Nick's house, homework first, and that meant right after school. Nick had heard his older brother James groan and grumble about this rule for years, right up until he graduated from high school 2 years ago. And then James wrote home from college after his first semester and said, "My grades are looking great because when I came here, I already knew how to put first things first." That letter was the proof of Nick's mom and dad had been looking for. Homework first was the law from September to June. This had never bothered Nick before because he hardly ever had homework. Oh, sure, he looked over his spelling words on Thursday nights, and there had been a few short book reports in 4th grade, but other than that, nothing. Up until now, schoolwork never spilled over into his free time. Thanks to Mrs. Granger, those days were gone. First, he looked up the definitions in the brand new red dictionary that his mom had bought because Mrs. Granger told her to. It took almost an hour. He could hear a baseball game in John's yard down the street, yelling and shouting, and every few minutes the sharp crack of a bat connecting with a pitch. But he had a report to do for Mrs. Granger. Nick looked at the very front of the dictionary. There was an introduction to the book called Words and Their Origins. Perfect, Nick thought. It was just what he needed to do his report. It would all be over in a few minutes. Nick could already feel the sun and the breeze on his face as he ran outside to play homework. All done once his homework was done. So here he is. There's Nick, trying to come up with his homework. Then he read the first sentence from the introduction. Without question, this modern American dictionary is one of the most surprisingly complex and profound documents ever to be created, for it embodies unparalleled detail reflecting not only super lexicographic scholarship, but also the dreams and speech and imaginative talents of millions of people over thousands of years. For every person who has ever spoken or written in English has had a hand in its making. What? Nick scratched his head and read it again. And again. Not much better. It was sort of like trying to read the ingredients on a shampoo bottle. He slammed the dictionary shut and walked downstairs. Nick's family did a lot of reading, so bookshelves covered 3 or 4 walls in the family room. There were 2 sets of encyclopedias. The black set was for grown-ups, and the red set was for kids. Nick pulled out the D volume from the red set and looked up dictionary. There were 3 full pages with headings like Early Dictionaries, Word Detectives, and Dictionaries Today. Not very exciting, but he had to do it, so Nick just plopped down on the couch and read all of it. And when he was finished with the kids' book, he opened up the black encyclopedia and read most of what it said about dictionaries too. He understood only about half of what he read. He leaned back on the couch and covered his eyes with his arm, trying to imagine himself giving a report on all the boring stuff. He'd be lucky to have 3 minutes worth, but because Nick was Nick, he suddenly had an idea. It brought a grin to his face. Nick decided that giving this report could actually be fun. He could make it into something special. After all, Mrs. Granger had asked for it. So I wonder what he's going to do. I haven't read this story. I know some of you all have, but I don't know what's going to happen. So chapter 5, this will be the last chapter. The report. By lunchtime the next day, Nick had a bad feeling in the pit of his stomach. 7th period was coming. He was going to have to stand up in front of Mrs. Granger's class. The eyes of everyone in the class would be glued to his face, and Mrs. Granger's eyes would be cranked up to maximum punch power. He looked over his notes again and again. The first English dictionary, the growth of the English language, William Shakespeare, words from French and German, new words, old words, new inventions, Latin and Greek roots, American English. It all became a big jumble in his mind. And his grand plan from the night before in the harsh fluorescent light of the school day, it seemed impossible. What is it with the clocks in school? When you're planning to go to the carnival after school, the clocks in every class particularly run backward, and the school day lasts for about 3 weeks. That's true. But if you have to go to the barber or go shopping for clothes after school, zip, the whole day is over before you can blink. And today, after lunch, periods 5 and 6 went by in 2 ticks. As the 7th period bell rang, Mrs. Granger walked into the classroom, took 4 steps to her desk at the side of the room, flipped open her attendance book, glanced out at the class, and made 2 little check marks. Then looking up at Nick, she said, "I think we have a little report to begin our class today. Nicholas?" 15 seconds into the 7th period, and Nick was on stage. This lady plays for keeps, thought Nick. He gulped, grabbed his crumbled note cards in his book bag, and walked to the front of the room. He stood next to the giant dictionary on its little table, and Mrs. Granger walked to the back of the classroom and sat primly on a tall stool next to the bookcase. She was wearing her blue uniform. Taking a deep breath, Nick began. "Well, the first thing I learned is that the first English dictionary..." Mrs. Granger interrupted. "Excuse me, Nicholas, but does your report have a title?" Nick looked blankly at her. "A title? No, I didn't make a title. Class, please remember to include a title whenever you prepare an oral or written report. Now please go on, Nicholas. And she smiled and nodded at him. Nick began again. Looking right at Mrs. Granger, he said, "The dictionary." A couple of kids thought that was funny, but Nick played it straight and just kept talking. A lot of people think that the first English dictionary was put together in the 1700s by a man named Samuel Johnson. He lived in London, England. He was real smart and he wrote a lot of books, and he wanted all the other smart people to have a good dictionary to use, so he made one. But there were other dictionaries before his. The thing that was different about Johnson's dictionary was its size, first of all. He had over 43,000 words in it. The class made a bunch of noise at this big number. Ooh, wow, stuff like that. And Nick lost his concentration. He glanced up at Mrs. Granger, expecting to see those eyes drilling a hole in him, but they weren't. They were almost friendly, in a teachery kind of way. She shushed the class and said, "Go on, Nicholas. That's a very fine beginning." Nick almost smiled, but he saw all the kids staring at him, so he gripped his note cards even tighter and jumped back in. The other thing that Samuel Johnson did that was special was to choose the words he thought were more important and then give lots of examples showing how the words got used by people. For example, he showed how the word take could be used in 113 different ways. Nick's report went on smoothly for 12 minutes. Nick was surprised at how easy it was to stand there and talk about this stuff. At the end of the first 5 minutes, Mrs. Granger had to stop Nick again to say, "Class, it is not good manners to yawn out loud or to put your heads down on your desk when someone is giving an oral report." No one in the class cared one bit about the report except Mrs. Granger. Every time Nick glanced up, she was smiling. And her eyes were not the least bit icy or sharp. She was eating this stuff up, listening and nodding, and every once in a while she would say, "Very good point," or "Yes, that's exactly right." But the next time Nick looked up, he saw Mrs. Granger sneaking a look at her watch. 18 minutes gone. Maybe his idea was going to work after all. Time for phase 2. Reaching into his book bag, Nick pulled out the red dictionary he had brought from home, the one most of the kids had, the one Mrs. Granger said they should use. Nick said, "This is the dictionary that I use at home for my vocabulary work, and I opened it up last night to the very front, and right there I found out a lot about how the dictionary was made, right in this book. So I thought some of the ideas would be good as part of my report. It says here, Nicholas?" Nick looked up. Mrs. Granger got off her tall stool and its wooden legs made a screech on the aluminum. Heads snapped to attention, and the class was alert again. Mrs. Granger smiled, raised her eyebrows, and pointed at her watch. "Nicholas, I think the class should read that at home themselves." John's hand was up in the air, and at Mrs. Granger's nod, he said, "But I don't have that dictionary at home, Mrs. Granger. I have the blue one." And several other kids immediately said, "Me too." Mrs. Granger tried not to show that she was annoyed. "Very well, Nick, but it shouldn't take too long. We have other things to do today." Nick kept his eyes open wide and nodded, adjusted his glasses on his nose, and began to read. Without question, this modern American dictionary is one of the most surprisingly complex and profound documents ever to be created, for it embodies unparalleled detail reflecting not only superb scholarship, but also the dreams and speech and imaginative talents of millions of people over thousands of years. For every person who has ever spoken or written in English has had a hand in its making. It was a long article, and the kids were bored to death, but no one looked bored at all. Every kid in the room knew now that the period was more than half over, and that Nick's report wasn't just a report. It was one of the greatest time wasters he had ever invented. Mrs. Granger knew it too. She had edged around from the back of the room to the side near the windows. Nick glanced up at her now and then as he read, and each time Mrs. Granger's eyes clicked up to a new power level. After 8 minutes of Nick's best nonstop reading, her eyes were practically burning holes in the chalkboard behind him. There were only 10 minutes left in 7th period. When he took a breath to start a new paragraph, Miss Granger cut him off. "That's a fine place to stop, Nicholas. Class, let's all give him a round of applause for his report." The applause didn't last long. As Nick took his book bag and notes and sat down, Mrs. Granger's eyes went back to almost normal, and she actually smiled at him. "Although your report was a little long," she paused to let that sink in, "it was quite good. And isn't it fascinating that English has more different words than any other language used anywhere in the world?" She pointed at her large dictionary. "That one book contains the definitions of more than 450,000 words. Now, wasn't I right, Nicholas? All this will mean so much more since you learned about it on your own." Mrs. Granger was beaming at him. Nick sank lower in his chair. This was worse than writing the report, worse than standing up to give it. He was being treated like the teacher's pet, and he had the feeling she was doing it on purpose. His reputation was in great danger, so he launched another question. He raised his hand, and he didn't even wait for Mrs. Granger to call on him. Yeah, but I still don't really get the idea of why words all mean different things. Like, who says that dog means the thing that goes woof and wags its tail? Who says so? And Mrs. Granger took the bait. Who says dog means dog? You do, Nicholas. You and I and everyone in this class, in this school, in this town, in this state, in this country, we all agree. If we lived in France, we would all agree that the right word for the hairy four-legged creature was a different word, sheen. It sounds like sheen, but it means what dog means to us. And in Germany, they say Hund, and so on, all around the globe. But if all of us in the room decided to call the creature something else, and if everyone else did too, then that's what it would be called. And one day, it would be written in the dictionary that way. We decide what goes in that book. And she pointed at the giant dictionary, and she looked right at Nick, and she smiled again. Then Mrs. Granger went on. But of course, that dictionary was worked on by hundreds of very smart people for many years. So as far as we are concerned, that dictionary is the law. Laws can change, of course, but only if they need to. There may be new words that need to be made, but the ones in the book have been put there for a good reason. Mrs. Granger took a look at the clock. 8 minutes left. Now then, for today, you were to have done the exercise beginning on page 12 in your Words Alive book. Please get out your papers. Sarah, will you read the first sentence, identify the mistake, and then tell us how you corrected it? Mrs. Granger jammed the whole day's work into the last 8 minutes. A blur of verbs and nouns and prepositions, and yes, there was another homework assignment. And Nick didn't try to sidetrack Mrs. G again. He had slowed her down a little, but had he stopped her? No way. She was unstoppable, at least for today. So next week we will read chapter 6, which is the big idea. Like I said, some of you all have already read the book Friendle. I haven't, so it's actually new to me. And I try to switch up the scenery and have it outside this week. I hope y'all like that. I might not do that next week because a bug really bit my nose, I'm pretty sure. So I might have a bug bite. Oh, there went my cat, sorry. You probably seen the cats running around the entire video too, so I'm sorry about that. But I thought it would be nice to switch up the scenery because all you see is a classroom or my bedroom. So I decided to do it outside. So I don't know where I will do next week's chapters. I don't know how many chapters we'll read next week either. It kind of just depends on how long they take me to read. But this book isn't a very long book. I think it just has 15 chapters. Let me look real quick and see. Yeah, so it only has 15 chapters, and we're already on chapter 6. So we will probably finish the book up not next week, but the week after next. So I hope you're liking it. I kind of wanted to switch it up a little bit. Last week we talked about context clues, and this week, see, there's that mosquito again. I'm telling you, I'm getting ate up out here. Anyway, next week I will continue reading this book, and then the week after that we'll read this book. And when we finish this book, I might leave it to where we just have a few chapters left and give you a little quiz on it. So make sure you're paying attention to my video and actually listening to the story. And for the ones that have already read it, you probably already know what's going to happen, and that's great. But I don't, so I'm actually really excited to see what happens. And I think it's interesting how Nick is trying to get his teacher sidetracked, because some of you all do that. And don't say you don't, because I know you do. I've either been your substitute or I know you just by in the hallway. So I know how you all are. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the book Friendle, and we're going to continue it next week and the week after that. And remember to be paying attention because I'm giving you a quiz on it. Hope you have a great week, and I will see you next week. Bye!